Hello. It is Writing Wednesday again, and it's a beautiful early summer day here in LA. Don't really need the sweater, but I thought it was cute. Hello. Well, today I thought we would talk about dialogue, dialogue in fiction. And dialogue in fiction is very different than dialogue that you and I would have. It's very different than the dialogue I have with my neighbors when I go out to get my mail. And my neighbor sees me and goes, "Hi," and I go, "Hi," and she goes, "How are you?" And I'm like, "Great, how are you?" "Great, what's going on? How are the kids?" "Oh, they're fine, how's the husband?" "Well, his knee's been better, blah, blah, blah." Real dialogue in real life is almost the opposite of dialogue in on the page. Fictional dialogue and real life dialogue. Real life dialogue is how's it going? How's the kids? So that is dialogue that's intended to show that you're friendly. It could be done just, "Hi, hi, hi, I am friend. We are friends. We know each other. I know you have kids. I know that your husband had a knee operation." It shows that we're familiar. It shows that it kind of greases the wheels of community. The idea of dialogue in reality is to avoid conflict, to avoid getting into it with people. Your neighbors could be very different from you politically and socially and in every other way. And, by not getting into it, we reinforce that we can depend on each other, that we know each other. Dialogue on the page is the opposite. Dialogue on the page is about conflict. And that's where you start the dialogue. You skip all that, what I call meet and greet. Hello, how are you? Nice to see you, blah, 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 blah. Nothing's happening. We discussed what is a scene in an earlier Writing Wednesday. What is a scene? Something happens in a scene. And until something starts to happen, you don't need the scene. You don't need all that meet and greet. You just go right to where stuff starts to happen. Now, the thing about the dialogue scene is rather than thinking about dialogue, think about the dialogue scene. It is still a scene. So you're still going to need all of the tools of fiction writing. The world doesn't stop, disappear, and then somebody emits dialogue. There's always light, there's always sound, there's always smells, there's always landscape, there's always the internal world going on. People think while they're talking. When somebody stops talking, you hear other sounds. There's a room. Room doesn't disappear because somebody's talking. There continues to be a room, and you as writer have to make the room appear for the reader. So in a way, you can think of the dialogue scene as the three-ring circus of fiction writing, that you have to be able to ride the unicycle and spin the plates and go around and have your characters emit dialogue. So you have to have all the other tools of fiction writing, and then we'll throw one more ball in there, which is people talking. So when you look at bad dialogue, usually you can see it on the page. You don't even have to read it. And let me tell you, I believe that, as somebody who sometimes gives quotes for books, editors who read, you have no idea how much they read. Agents, you have no idea how much they read. Piles up the walls. Now what's going to make or break a manuscript that's being submitted, is often they turn right to the dialogue. I know I do. And if the dialogue looks like, like dialogue chugging down the page with no description, with no world, with no internal thoughts, no gestures, no, people don't have particular voices, don't sound like anything. I just assume that person can't write. And that would be the end of my reading of their manuscript. And I believe that a lot of agents and editors are the same way. Dialogue is the proof of the pudding. Can you write or can't you? The dialogue will show whether you can do it or not. So I'm here to give you some tips about that. I'm going to close this door so we don't hear the trash and the washing machine and so forth. There we go. Back in the lair. Have to be in the lair here. Yeah. Okay. So you don't want to see blocks of dialogue, blocks of description, and then blocks of dialogue. It's not a screenplay. You have to put it in the blender and have a little bit of everything going on. And gesture is extremely important, and gesture is something that most writers just are working so hard just to get the story down that they're not necessarily paying attention to the building blocks and what makes these things interesting to us. When you somebody talks, you're watching your point of view character, you as a person, you're watching how the other person is reacting to what you're saying. And that should always be, an intrinsic part of the dialogue. When I am doing an edit, a critique, as we talked about last week, I'll put RX on the page, and that means reaction. Like, what's the person just sitting there? Are they comatose? Have they taken too much OxyContin? I mean, there's usually some sort of reaction, and so you're always judging the reaction as you're speaking, which is why it's so weird to be doing a Facebook Live. But we know that when we travel, if you ever traveled in a country where you don't speak the language, you can still make yourself understood by gesture and tone of voice. And you need to start in your writer's notebook. You need to start amassing gestures and tones of voice. So I would say watch a movie with, where you can hold the remote. You can pause. And when a character is talking, stop it and describe the gesture. Describe how they're sitting, how they cross their legs or uncross them in this bit of dialogue. Watch hand gestures, super important. There are hundreds of things a person could be doing with their hands while they're speaking or while somebody else is speaking. You never notice your own gestures. You know other people's gestures. How they're sitting when they cross their legs, how they cross their legs, how they put their arms. How do you describe the different things hands can do? The different gestures, like somebody's listening to you and somebody else is going, like my kid used to do, blah, blah, blah. Smart ass. But, how would you describe this gesture? How do you describe this gesture? When somebody's sitting like this, or they're sitting like this, they're sitting like this. Stop that movie and describe that gesture. Also, keep a running list of voices. How would you describe my voice? How would you describe Cary Grant's voice? Start with the really distinguished voices we all know. How would you describe Woody Allen's voice? How would you describe, Lucille Ball's voice? And then, keep them in your writer's notebooks. And then you can give them to people in your writing, and it really helps distinguish them. So gesture is hugely important. When people are silent in an intense discussion, the silences can be very important. So think about the proportion of utterance where a person's, the words that we're speaking, the content of your dialogue scene. If the dialogue scene were a sundae, what's the utterance part of that? Is it the ice cream? Is it the whipped cream? Is it the hot fudge? Is it the bananas? Or is it the nuts on top? Think about that the utterance should be the nuts on top, and that all the other tools should be the bulk of the scene. So that brings me to the first visual here, because the best way to teach dialogue writing is to teach bad dialogue. So we're going to look at some bad dialogue, and then we're going to discuss it. Now, this was an actual sample of a manuscript I once edited, but it's been condensed. There's only a page of it, and there were like 3 pages of it in the manuscript that I looked at. The writer is anonymous, because I don't think this was ever published. But this is the kind of bad writing, that an editor will see on a daily basis. And you can see bad dialogue, and then you can notice when you look at your own dialogue, you go, oh God, I just did that. Gotta fix that. Okay, so here I'm going to flip this. Hey! Okay. This is what bad dialogue looks like on the page. Can you see how it just chugs down? There's no gesture, there's no internal thoughts, there's no world. What room are they in? They're kind of swimming around in mid-ocean. What time of day is it? What's the light doing? What are these characters thinking as they look at each other? What do they look like? See how none of it's there? None of it's there. So I'm going to read this. I had things to talk to Marcia about. The whole affair with Peter Blake. I went over to her house. Marcia came to the door. Hey, Mindy, how's it going? Fine, it's great to see you. How's it going with you? Fine, you've lost some weight. Yeah, how about that? It looks great, and that shirt just rocks. Want some coffee? I'd love a cup. We went into her kitchen. I sat at the counter, and she poured me some coffee. You make the best coffee. Thanks, she said. Want some milk? Please. Sugar? No, just milk. Want a muffin? I made them myself. Wow, you did? That's fantastic. I'd love a muffin. Blueberry or cranberry? You made both? Wow, that's great. Cranberry, I think. So I call this the muffin scene. This is what you do not want to produce, is the muffin scene. There's some problems with the muffin scene. This is the kind of bad writing that editors see on a daily basis, not just from beginners, but it's the difficulty of the dialogue scene. It's the hardest thing in writing. If a scene is about conflict and a change, what is the conflict or change about coming in, having coffee, getting a muffin, compliments on shirts and so forth? Nothing is happening. And as we know, if nothing is happening, you don't need it. You don't need it. You don't need it. How long do you think this is going to take until the author actually gets to the point of the scene. You know you're going to have pages of this before they actually get down to it. And something happens too that I call entrances and exits problem. And that means a person takes so long to get into the meat of the scene that they're exhausted by the time they get there. Once this person gets to the point of why she came, she's already going to be exhausted just eating all that muffin. And the problem itself will probably be delivered in 3 lines. So taking too long to get into the meat of the scene, and then exits problem, taking too long to get out. Once you've had your scene, once whatever happened, you jump to the next. You get out of there. So here's what I would say is a remedy for the muffin. Oh, did I remedy the muffin scene? Let's see. Yes, I did. Okay, so we talk about the muffin scene. I call that stripped dialogue, where there's just nothing but screenplay dialogue. That's not how fiction works. You have an integral scene where everything is firing in. So it's stripped of everything that makes a fictional scene. And my own dialogue scenes might look like that when I start, but they never, ever, ever leave the office looking like that. Never. So there's not going to be a scene until the woman gets to the point, right? And we've all even had these conversations like, come on, So that's the reader going, come on already. So what if we forget all that meet and greet and get on with it? I'd rather the woman had just gone over to Marcia's in that muffin scene and just said, "Hi, Marcia, do you have a minute?" Takes care of everything. "Hi, Marcia, do you have a minute?" Marcia looked worried. "Sure, Mindy, what's the problem?" Get to the problem. All right. We went into her kitchen. She poured me some coffee. Yeah! You don't need dialogue when there's no conflict. There's no conflict, just get to it. People don't need to speak. She poured some coffee, and over homemade muffins. See, I got the muffins. I'm not skipping the muffins. But it's just in passing. My God, you don't need to talk about it. Homemade muffins. I explained to her how Peter Blake had been skimming funds from the soccer league. There you go. Now you're into your conflict. But still, we need conflict. So we've brought up that there's a problem. Then, "I don't believe it," said Marcia. "He's not like that at all. There's no way he could do such a thing." So what's the difference between the two scenes? Is that in the two most important things of the dialogue writing, first there's compression. I just got to it, the little lines of narrative, and we're into what's interesting about it. Inexperienced writers' characters talk too much. There's too much dialogue, and nobody says enough in a single line. So compress. Get rid of the chatty stuff and compress what people are saying. And it's because people mostly replicate what we hear in daily life. That is not fictional dialogue. That, a hi neighbor kind of thing. It's social ritual, right? Fictional dialogue is what people do to each other. They're putting pressure on each other with what they say. If they're not putting pressure on each other, that's why the muffin thing, I don't have Marcia talking until she disagrees. Because now we're putting pressure on each other. So think of dialogue as the only reason for people to speak in fiction. is for conflict. It's the only reason. And if there's no conflict, you don't need dialogue. You don't need to talk to the donut man. You don't need all that. So everybody is putting pressure. You put pressure on each other. It can be a wrestling match where they're trying to pin each other. That's what you mean when people say dialogue is about conflict. It doesn't mean they're screaming at each other. It means that each person has a point of view and they come up against each other. If people agree, you don't need dialogue. Nice dress. What do you mean by that? What's wrong with it? That's dialogue. So it doesn't really mean even that people are fighting necessarily. You know, we could want the same thing. Like, have you ever tried to comfort somebody who wants to be comforted, but what you're doing is wrong? The way you said it was wrong. Two people can want the same thing, but have conflict. You know, if I'm in a bar, say, you know, looking for some companionship, and some guy is talking to me, and he wants some companionship too. We want the same thing, but he wants to leave now, and I want him to sweet talk me some more. I want to stay in the bar for a while and get a sense of him. So although we want the same thing, we don't want exactly the same thing, or the timing is different. There always can be conflict, and that is what dialogue is for, thwarting immediate goals, you know, so it's not for exposition. You don't use it to tell the character's backstory. You don't use it to describe things. It's for conflict. So think of it as a racehorse. You can't just throw a bunch of junk on it. It'll slow it down and keep it from doing the one thing that it has been raised for generations, which is speed alone. You can't just throw everything into your dialogue. Keep it for the conflict. It's not to tell the backstory. Unlike fiction, unlike the visual media, which everybody is so drenched with, right? Screenwriting and TV writing, where somebody has to say things for us to know. In fiction, they can think it, and we know. And then for them to think one thing and say another thing is always really interesting. So you can completely just come out and say, Maggie remembered when she fell and cut her knee open. She doesn't have to tell somebody about it. Here's another bit of bad dialogue. Let's see if I can find it. This was a terrible piece of dialogue. They settled down to eat. "This is really good, Grandma," Sabrina said. "Yeah, it is, Mom, as usual." "Oh, it's nothing," said Dorothy. "So how is work, Maureen? Any big cases coming up?" "Yes, as a matter of fact, the city wants to take on a developer in town," Maureen explained. "I've already filed the paperwork to set in motion a suit if it comes to that. The developer wants to tear down some old buildings to build a retail center. The city has deemed the buildings historic, but the developer is still moving to get rid of them, all in the name of progress." "I just don't understand people who don't see the value of history," Dorothy said. "You can't replace buildings and items from the past. You can't make them again. Oh, sure, you could make them like the things of the past, but it just isn't the same." "I agree," said Maureen. "Well, someone is going to have to sacrifice, and it's my job to see that it isn't the city." Okay, so Dorothy, the grandmother, Maureen the mother, and then Sabrina just gets a line, the granddaughter. Now, what's wrong with this thing? Okay, what's wrong is they agree on everything. I agree. God. Okay, so if they agree, you don't need it. Second, it's the exposition in the dialogue. It's tedious. That the developer set into motion the suit of blah, wants to tear down some old buildings, and the city is deemed the blah, blah, blah. This is not what dialogue is for. This is like throwing your dresser and your mattress on that thoroughbred. Its knees are just buckling. It's terrible to read. So you want to skip the meet and greet. You want to definitely use exposition as for what it's intended for, and not just throw anything you want the reader to know. This is fiction. You can just tell us and save for the dialogue. So here's my rewrite of this. So what if Dorothy didn't agree with Maureen? Then you're going to get somewhere. So here's my rewrite of this. Okay, they settled down to eat. This is really good, Grandma, Sabina said. Yeah, it is, Mom, as usual. Oh, it's nothing, Dorothy said. So how's work, Maureen? Any big cases coming up? Okay, now listen to this. Oh, where are we? So any new cases coming up, Dorothy said. Maureen told her about the Barrington development, 100 new units right where the old Trident Theater was. See how we already have more information than we would have before? You can't do that in dialogue. Now we know it's the Barrington development. It's 100 new units, and it's right where the old theater was. Now here's the dialogue. But the city's going to take them to the mat to keep that block intact. I'll be damned if we're going to let the Trident be torn down. Where would I be if you and Dad hadn't had your first date there? So now we know more about the characters. So the information is delivered in the line. Now the conflict is the way the second person responds to what the first person says, right? So here she said that she's going to fight it, is basically what her dialogue says. Oh, that place was a rat hole, Dorothy said, the grandmother. You couldn't get two seats together that one wasn't sprung and the ceiling leaked. I think they should tear the whole damn thing down. They have a right to build those units. People have got to have somewhere to live. Okay, so now Grandma has completely blocked everything that Maureen has said. It's just like playing chess. She's put an obstacle, or go really. She's put an obstacle right in front of everything that the daughter believes in. That they should have development, that the daughter's wrong, that, this wonderful theater that she wanted to save isn't worth a damn. Okay, now it's on, right? Maureen sat gazing at her mother. Reaction. Maureen sat gazing at her mother, open-mouthed, as if some alien had replaced Dorothy at her little chrome-edged kitchen table. A little bit of landscape. Yes, but planned development, sensible development. And then I have her interrupt, so the long dash. Sensible development, long dash. Hogwash, Dorothy said. Some people just don't want anything to change. Like you. Look at that dress. How long have I been looking at that thing? Just because something's old doesn't mean it's any good. Okay, so you see the difference. There's, in the first one we agreed on everything, a lot of dialogue, a lot of exposition in the narrative, and nobody had a voice. Nobody had a vocabulary that was particular to them. But we can see Dorothy says stuff like hogwash and rat hole, and she has her own way of speaking. Maureen, too, has a more considered kind of language. She uses things like intact, sensible, planned development. We see that she's sort of a careful woman, and her mother is much more forceful. Now, from this dialogue, you can see that in the wrestling match that is this dialogue scene, who's going to win? Oh, the mother's going to win. The grandmother's going to win. She's a much stronger character. She has more of a sense of what she believes, and she's not trying to be careful. Also, in any wrestling match, dialogue scene, you don't have to answer questions like deposition, the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. People always are trying to win, so they change their tactics to win. Here, Dorothy goes from talking about the development to attacking the daughter's sense of clothing and just her way of life. She's saying, this is typical of you. So you can see that there's a personal issue here. That is, Dorothy is taking it from the intellectual issue of the development to a personal level. So she's a better fighter. She's a dirty fighter, but she's a better fighter. So I put my money on Dorothy. That's why I'm watching this little boxing match, because I have my money on the grandmother to win. Look at that dress. So we're just scratching the surface of dialogue, but so good dialogue is about conflict and reveals character. So each line shows the point of view of that character. We're physically different. They have a different kind of breath. Everybody takes a different breath. Some people are long-winded. Some people will do short sentences. Some people, some people are very quick and incisive. So you want to show who people are by how they speak. You want gestures. Some people win by they interrupt. Some people speak quickly. They interrupt. They're forceful. An uncertain person will trail off. They will wait for a break in the conversation to get a word in. They never just push their way in. Lets the other person have a speech. Usually in dialogue, there's no speeches, because in real life, people get about one line or two lines, and the other person cuts them off. Nobody stands for a speech unless there's a real power differential, and that's in the dialogue. You can see that a boss will get to have a speech, a parent lecturing a kid, a teacher. They're the only ones who get to have a speech, and then you can do the internal reactions or the gestures. Teacher is speechifying and the kid is like carving his name in the desk. Gesture always is part of any dialogue scene. Silence is part of any dialogue scene. And as any good actor will tell you, the person who controls the silence controls the scene. But remember that only a generic person can speak generically. And there is no such thing as a generic person. So the language, the actual utterance, always varies from character to character. You can't just come in with the same voice for all. It's not like... these are all people. And dialogue will tell you about the relationship between the characters. Like you can tell what Maureen and Dorothy's, in my version, you can tell what their relationship is. That Dorothy is always, going to push that girl around. And Maureen is always going to be sensible and trying to convince with rationality. And it's not going to fly in her family. And that Dorothy is actually more modern than Maureen. Maureen is the preservationist. And, remember you and Dad met at that theater. Whereas Dorothy's like, tear it down, it's a mess, it's a rat hole. You got to stay current. People need somewhere to live, and that's reality. So, and then the better characters know each other, the more pressure they can put on each other. And when I do, probably next week, I'll do another run of dialogue. But this is your Writing Wednesday, and I wish you good writing.